Today we're going to talk about the camera. You want to be sure to put your camera on M for manual, and that way if you want to adjust your aperture, you would press this little AV button here with your thumb and you would rotate this little dial here. That will adjust your aperture or your f-stop, which is responsible for the amount of light that comes into your sensor or your image. If you just rotate this little dial right here, this will adjust your shutter. Manual is right there. Your ISO is right here. So you can adjust your ISO. Here's where some of the different types of cameras are. Another kind of camera. Here's where your shutter is at an 80th. Here's where your ISO will be adjusted. We'll go into that in a few minutes. Here is your f-stop or your aperture. It's right over here. Sorry, right there. Your ISO setting is right here, or it might be on the front of your camera. Your ISO is responsible for how sensitive the image sensor is in the camera to light. So a normal day ISO is between 100 or 200. The later the day gets, or the darker the day gets, you would have to adjust your ISO 400, 800, 1600. So you would use a lower number when you shoot with lots of light, like ASA or ISO. They're both the same thing, 50, 100, 200. The higher the ISO you would use with the darker light would be 400, 800, etc. Your ISO, the normal ISO for regular daylight, is 200. The higher the ISO would be 400 and above. Here's an example of what happens when you raise your ISO. At 200, you have a very crisp image. When you raise it in lower light to 3200, you'll start getting these little pixelations or grain if you were shooting film. So outside bright sun, you would choose 1 to 200. Shade or overcast, 400. Indoors, 400. Stormy or darker or overcast days, you would go 800 and above. So a little light can leave some of your images dark. So here we have ISO 200, and it's a dark lit situation, so it doesn't expose properly. Here's a higher ISO shot at night at ISO 800. It's more grainy, but you'll get the detail with grain. Your light meter, here's your normal exposure. You will be able to see it right here on the back of your camera. You'll also be able to see it in your viewfinder. If your little number here is over here, it'll be overexposed, or your image will be lighter. If it's over here, it'll be underexposed or darker. Here's another example of what your light meter will look like. And remember, wherever your metering grid inside your camera that you chose, whether it's spot meter or metering around the image, that's where your camera will meter it correctly. So the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. If you change any of these, this will affect your image. Your aperture is the amount of light that hits your sensor. The smaller the number of f-stop or aperture, the more light is let in. Also, shallower depth of field. Here's where you adjust your aperture. You would press this little AV button, as well as you would rotate this little wheel on the front of your camera. This is an example of a larger aperture. You can see that it is on f2. The photographer is here. He's focusing on the center figure, center model. Anything in front or behind the subject is out of focus. This is the exact same photograph, but it is adjusted down to f16 right here. So everything in the frame is sharp and in focus. Here's an example of the aperture inside your camera. It is called f-stop or aperture. The maximum is 1.4. The minimum is f22. Anything at f22 will be very sharp. Anything at f1.4 will have selective depth of field. Here's an example where your focus is right here. Things in front and things behind are out of focus. Here's another example where the entire scene is sharp, so it is brought down to f16 or f22. Here's a selective depth of field. This is out of focus. This could be like sharp for just a certain area. This entire scene would be f16 or f22, completely sharp. Selective depth of field, probably 1.2, 2.8. Everything is sharp, f16 or f22. Everything is sharp, 16, f22. Selective depth of field. Your focus is right here. Whatever's in front and behind is out of focus. It would be like f2.8 or 3.6. Another selective depth of field. This is what is most important. This is probably, I would say maybe f3.5. Everything in front and behind is out of focus, maybe 2.8. Everything is sharp, f16 or f22. Your focus holds from the front to the back. Here's an example of f4. Just your bottle is sharp, everything else out of focus. f22, it holds your focus. This should be completely sharp back here, but it's not, but it should be. Is this shallow depth of field? I would say yes. The only plane of focus is right here at f2.8, 1.2. An example of 2.8, f11, and f32. All is sharp. This holds mostly sharp, and just this plane of focus is sharp. So here's where your shutter speed will read inside your camera. You would adjust this little wheel on the front of your camera to change your shutter speed. And again, here's where your ISO would change. You would hold that down and you'd rotate the wheel right here. So here again is your shutter. Here's your f-stop. So everything would be sharp in whatever frame they're shooting. Here's your ISO. Here's your metering system. Here's where your metering grid is inside your camera. They have auto white balance, and they're going to do one shot at a time. Here's your main dial for changing your aperture by pushing the AV button on the very back of your camera and rotating, or rotating this just for your shutter. Or if you were changing your ISO, you would press wherever the ISO is up here. I don't see it. It must be on the back. Oh, here it is right here. Sorry. And you would rotate that, holding that in. Your shutter speed, again, it is the amount of time that the shutter is open, like your curtains in your house. Your slow shutter at an 80th will have much more blur. Your fast shutter at 1,000th will freeze your frame. Here's an example of 2,000th of a second, an example of 1/8. Here's some examples. Here's a fast shutter speed at 1,000th, slow at 1/15th. To increase your blur, it would be 100 or less. A 60th to a 4th would create a blur. This is a slow shutter speed. This is a fast shutter speed. Here's an example of different shutter speeds. And here you can take the exact same photo, but by changing your aperture and your shutter for a perfect exposure, by changing your shutter, you would get a totally different photograph where this is a blur at 1/8 of a second at f16, so it holds your focus, as compared to 500th, or where you freeze your frame and you have a select area that is sharp.